All right, we are recording. Welcome to Augur, February 17th. So where I see this, please connect to the internet error, it actually is where um, we're checking for the existence of our chaos.community website. And it's interesting that that seems to be not effective for some of the Augur installations, but it doesn't look like this when you encounter this error, it's actually stopping anything. It's just a thing that happens if you can't ping this website, I think.
So if it has no connection to the internet though, then it's gonna happen. But I guess why is why is
Well, I
being
think
able
it's yeah, it's my question is because I've checked the machines, there are connections to the internet, and now that I found this piece of code in Augur where this error message is generated, it it looks like there must be some issues with connecting to the non-secure version of chaos.community. Um,
I guess why is that a condition for building Augur?
It's not for building, it is for starting, but it probably is not a great one. We should probably identify some other mechanism for testing that we have internet access. This
Yeah.
one's probably worked for at least a couple years, but obviously something has gone wrong with this check on some instances now. So, all right, that's good to keep track of. We should add that to the issue, John, and get that tracked down.
Okay, I can do that. But I guess in summary, just to summarize what we went over since we didn't start recording until after this. So the issue on 2998 where it's showing invalid keys is unrelated to the issue where the Augur instance is unable to connect to the internet, at least as far as we can determine here. If an invalid key is found during startup, it's just skipped, and then a warning message is logged. And so that actually should not affect your ability to start Augur. But what we have just talked about here with the unable to connect to the internet thing is because the URL http chaos.community is not reachable somehow.
And my guess is its apparent sudden non-reachability is probably related to some kind of default security configuration on the server where that's hosted, where it no longer returns a ping without it being a secure connection. And it obviously used to. That's my theory about what could have changed there. I have seen, John, where when there's an instance that encounters this issue, it throws the error. It'll do the facade jobs and it'll do some of the um, core and secondary jobs up to a point, but then it does seem to stop. So it's obviously something that we should be looking into a little bit. It seems to only be an issue on some instances. So I mean, part of me is I don't want to go too far on this troubleshooting in a live meeting, but I think there might be something that's actually getting stopped somewhere along the line because of that, but we'll have to dig into it. Um, so with that, just some updates on the Dockerization of Augur. There's some folks, Alekia I see is here from Red Hat. There's some folks from Red Hat who are working with us on improving the cloud native capabilities of Augur. And we have an issue that's open with a checklist from Josh Burkus from like 3 years ago, giving us a checklist for reshaping Augur into being a cloud native solution, which means in short that it would run on something like Kubernetes and be able to distribute the workload that it has horizontally. And so some of our Red Hat contributors are looking at the improvement of Augur along those lines, and that would have a pretty significant impact on scaling. In the last release, we did improve the utilization of API keys significantly through an improvement in this key manager function that we were discussing as possibly creating an issue for collection on some instances a minute ago. It is doing a lot of key switching now, so you get more API calls out of the keys you have available to you now. Simply because we waste no API calls. So it's a more efficient rotation. I don't know, John, do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, do you want me to just summarize how the key
Yeah,
orchestration works?
yeah.
Okay. So the key orchestrator is a process that manages all of the keys as a single point of basically dictation. So it hands out the keys that it knows to be valid, and then it communicates with the workers about the status of the keys. So if a key is found to be invalid, what Augur previously would do, because it has expired, it would sleep until the key becomes fresh again. Meaning, so if it runs out of available requests, the Augur worker that was using that key just paused until that same key became fresh again. What we changed is that instead of doing that, the worker returns the key as expired, and then the key orchestrator marks the key as expired until such time as it refreshes and hands out a new fresh key back to that worker so that it can continue working immediately instead of pausing. So basically, we have made it such that you can basically go through all of the available requests across all of your keys as fast as possible, as opposed to what we were previously doing, which was having the workers basically stick to a single key for their entire process.
Yeah, thanks, John. That is kind of what we did there. So thank you.
Yep.
So I mentioned the Dockerization of Augur. I got some answers to my questions about 8-NAT troubleshooting, which I will go pursue after this meeting. Just trying to figure out why my 8-NAT instances decided not to start here this morning. And Adrian, I see that you've added something interested in requirements for identifier migration. Do you want to lead us into that?
Yeah, that was just kind of building on the conversation last meeting. I've been working on my capstone project for kind of distributed systems, and it seems like there might be some value in kind of, and it seems like there's been some previous attempts as well in the Augur database to kind of use something that isn't just an auto incrementing integer as like for the identifier in the repository table, and maybe ideally the rest of it, um, so that maybe eventually the database could kind of migrate towards something more like a federated type system or something. So I've been kind of focusing in just on that small piece of it just for my semester capstone. Um, and I think last time we were kind of throwing around various ideas, and I was just curious to kind of continue that and learn more about like what some of the requirements are. I've been looking into a few different kind of systems, like identifiers, like sort of DID, the DID spec that Blue Sky has been using and stuff like that. And I was just kind of curious which identifiers tools are going to be good for the job, or like how to kind of combine those. But
So, I mean, so obviously Augur's database contains a number of row keys that are just incremented integer like you described, and in some cases very few, candidly. But the two main ones I can think of are for the contributors, we have a synthetic key that is for each person that we identify as a distinct person. And that identifier is constructed from the hashing of various aspects of their identity, which include the actually, I don't remember what they include. And John, I don't know that you were here when we created that, but there's different like parts of the, person's identity that get constructed, and it has to do with name and GitHub or GitLab identifier and a few other factors, but I don't recall them all. So there's that one that's stored as a UUID in the database. So contributors have that identifier, and that one is designed to be unique across Augur instances. So you would get the same key for the same person, regardless of the instance that you have, pretty sure. I think I'd need to confirm that with Andrew. And then the other place where we have, where we use a centralized key is in the D, what is it called? I guess it's the disambiguation of repository identities from the platform. So both GitHub and GitLab have an identifier that they can return in their API that is just an integer in their case, that assures you that you have a repository that is unique to your Augur instance. And so those repository identifiers, what we call repo source ID, now in the repo table, those are all unique to the particular platform that a repo is on, and that helps us ensure uniqueness across Augur instances. Now, an improvement to that, I suppose, would be to use that identifier as a significant key locally in Augur, but I'm not sure that, so what we have on there right now is just a unique key for the platform unique integer, which ensures that each row is unique. I keep saying unique. And that's, of course, not the primary key. Those are row identifiers, but it is a different unique key on the record that kind of serves the purpose of ensuring that there are no duplicates. That, Adrian, might be something to look at. So there are,
Oh, like targeting one of those other, like the repo source
Yeah.
ID rather than just the row ID.
yeah. And I say that because the platforms do provide these identifiers for many of the things that we pull from the API. I can't say that I know that we don't currently pull the platform identifiers for any objects other than the repository. However, although I take that back, for the contributors, we also maintain uniqueness of the contributor login and ID. So I think leveraging the platform keys where they are available, and I think it's been a long time since I dug into, for example, the pull request or issue API to see what they return, but I do believe that they also return an identifier for a particular issue that is unique to GitHub or GitLab, whichever platform you're pulling from in a particular case. So I think those are things that already exist in the wild that you could think about as possible shortcuts to achieving the objectives that you have.
Is it still going to be a value? Because I remember last time we were discussing like, hey, maybe kind of a good baby step towards a more distributed kind of system is like just being able to merge and maybe even split like one Augur database into multiple or combine them in kinds of things. Is that still something that's valuable? Because I feel like that's kind of maybe where that was kind of the train of logic I was going down with thinking
I
about
mean,
the
I
row
think
IDs. Like if you're trying to combine databases, there might be conflicts there. So
there 100% would be conflicts there if you're trying to combine databases. So the combining strategy actually would be, I guess the word I might use is suboptimal, because there would still be that primary key of the row identifier. So that would have to be overcome to merge instances like you described. That's still true. And a lot of the logic in Augur does rely on that being unique. And over time, when you're querying an Augur instance, I think the human thing that happens is you become, if there's like 100 repos that you're constantly looking at and you're running queries, that list becomes something that you refer to very often and almost becomes second nature, so that you actually can if you're asked a question about a particular repository, you actually know the integer of Augur's identifier in your instance, and you can write that query lickety split without looking it up. So having that be unique across instances, obviously that would require some thought.
It sounds like that's probably maybe not super desirable, like especially if people are already remembering them and it's sort of
Yeah, I don't know.
maybe not
Well,
by
I
design,
think,
but
yeah, I mean, I think if they could be kept unique across instances, that would just change the way that identifiers are obtained by an instance. And I can think of any one of a number of hacks. One could be to have the identifier be meaningful in some way, perhaps some concatenation of the unique key on the platform and something else. It couldn't be hashed out of the repository URL because that is subject to change. You can always change the name and even the organization of a repository on these Git forges. So that couldn't be part of the key. And obviously a centralized store to get keys could be, could provide it, could end up being a blocking issue for instances of Augur if for some reason that service became unavailable for a period. I'm just thinking
yeah.
out loud here about all the things that can go wrong when you're trying to federate identity.
Well, that's kind of why I was interested in the DID spec, because that's essentially like I don't have the page open, but it seems like that's a system that's designed to allow like it's designed to allow anyone to kind of generate a key that they can like I think it's largely like I think a large part of it is like about ownership and crypto and stuff. Like being able to prove that like, oh, this is in fact my thing. I think it's the one I was looking most at was the W3C spec for it. Because I think that's ultimately what it's based on. Let me see if I can grab a link.
Yeah, I know AT Proto is the
Yeah, they use DID as part of like I mean,
right.
I'm not taking a ton from Blue Sky because that's mostly like a social media type use case, but I just put the link in chat if that helps. Um,
If I can find the chat window while I have other stuff up, which
I also just searched for the W3C DID. Yeah. So I think like the abstract of that kind of summarizes it fairly well. It's like, um, or maybe there was a video I watched, but essentially it's like anyone can kind of create, like it doesn't rely on this central system.
yeah,
Like it's kind of, like, I think it was even a good walkthrough video I found where someone, I don't know if it was someone who wrote this or wrote the spec or whatever, but they kind of walked through and like, hey, I already have a ton of IDs. Like I have my email address, I have like I can make a UUID, I've got like my ORC ID for academic publishing, but like all of these are kind like the ORC ID doesn't mean anything outside of their system. So if their system goes down, it's useless. Like and as we kind of presented DID as like, hey, this is kind of a solution to that where it's like there's kind of a document that underlie like a DID can be used to look up like a document that then contains like more information about um like you can use it for like establishing cryptographic exchange and stuff. Um so I don't know, but it
yeah.
also seems like that may not quite work for this use case because like it kind of it feels like having that kind of ownership like that would almost kind of require one particular Augur instance to like own the metrics for one repository, which it seems that like that might I don't know if that would prevent
I
other
think
instances from being able to do metrics on that repository, but that feels like the direction it's going. So I'm not sure. This might be overkill unless we're actually making this step into like federation and like, okay, here's this like Red Hat instance of Augur that monitors Red Hat repositories or something.
yeah, I think every instance of Augur relying on a connection to every other instance of Augur would break one of the assumptions about Augur, which is that I can operate my own Augur instance wherever I want. So like a fully federated model that actually required an instance of Augur to communicate information across all the other instances, that probably I won't say it wouldn't work, but I would say that would require a fairly long view of how we manage this information. That it would, I think, begin as a strategy and some follow-up on a document like this that could then be discussed in meetings like what we're having right here over time, just to
Yeah.
sort of press out what the real dependencies are and what the practical implications are for how Augur gets distributed.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to federate the whole thing like right now either. Like I'm just kind of like,
Right.
is there a small step I can take in that direction that's like well sized for a kind of university master's capstone?
I think that if I was to bite off a chunk that included DID, I think just a survey of, okay, well, what would be the steps and what are the questions at each step? So, I mean, my first question is how is the DID generated by this spec? In other words, what are the inputs to it that ensure its uniqueness, that its universal uniqueness? And
I
then what do I need to know in an individual Augur instance to implement it? And is there a way to do that without having access to all of the possible Augur instances in the world? Those are questions I would have as I went through it, Adrian.
Yeah, and I think I think with this, even if you scroll up a bit, the bit where it was kind of deconstructing the DID, or maybe down wherever it was, the bit that kind of shows the different parts of the DID,
Yeah,
up
I
more.
saw that. Yeah, oh, there it is. This
Yeah.
one, right?
I think essentially like the DID method, like it kind of segments it so that like I think Blue Sky defines their own method that I think is called PLC, and then from there they can like the identifier from after that point is kind of method specific. So it's kind of maybe there could be like DID augur, and then it would be up to us essentially to define how that ID is generated and all that. So I don't know if that helps, but I'm probably getting way too in the weeds for answering stuff with the limited time we have. So
I think the DID method, I think that's pretty straightforward. You would simply name the piece of software, specifically the method within that piece of software that generated the DID. And the identifier is probably very similar in requirements to the way that we generate the URI-based keys for contributors right now. So there are probably some specific inputs that are in the data that let us generate that. And I think, there are some things on the Augur team we've, I think, learned since we determined how we construct the URI. And that those things really are kind of what I was discussing at the beginning of the call, where there's identifier data in a lot of the API calls that we get back. And there are some things that we may have assumed to be reasonably stable that we may not be able to assume to be stable enough. That it might be a better strategy to make sure that all these methods focus on the platform identifiers for generating these DID method specific identifiers, et cetera. So yeah, it's turtles all the way down at that point. But it's an interesting question, because I think anyone doing analysis on data like this would ultimately prefer to have their identifiers be, common if the same data is gathered by two Augur instances, so that a combining of multiple instances would be a very straightforward activity. What other questions do folks have that they would like to chat about? If I'm happy to answer questions that anyone might have about their particular Augur instance with the time that remains. I know, Marcel, you were expressing that you had some things occur.
Yeah, I'm just trying around right now. So I added
Okay.
my first repositories and can see that it's collecting data. So
Yay.
that's a great point for now. one thing I'm just wondering is that the general repo table shows 0 commits for all projects, but if I take a look into the database, I can see that there are commits collected. So I'm not sure if this just is a visual error or not.
So, John, would you? So what I'm trying to remember right now, Marcel, is if the Augur, you're looking at the Augur front page and the counts of commits, you're seeing commits in there, but they're not reflected in the front end. My first thought is that I bet that data depends on the reconstruction of a materialized view. I don't know if
Yeah, the front
you,
end uses the front end does use the materialized views. So if it's not been updated, then it won't show up there.
And do they get updated regularly or?
they get updated, if you leave Augur running for 24 hours, they get updated
Okay.
by default every 24 hours.
Okay, yeah, makes
And
sense.
while you,
Yeah, it's an unfortunate trade-off. We have to use the materialized views for the front end because if we didn't, the query to get all the repos on a very large instance would take literally minutes. We have some instances with almost like 200,000 repos in them. And on those instances, loading all of the repos, we don't load all of them at a time. We load them in sections, but just loading a section of repos like 100 and some odd thousand in still takes a very long time. So the materialized views help us get cut down on the time it takes to respond to the front end's request.
and I checked, Marcel, there's the default configuration is for those materialized views to refresh once a day.
Okay, yeah.
So I think it may even be local clock time midnight that it's set to go off, but I could be wrong about that
Yeah, then
detail.
I just let it running and take a look tomorrow.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to go. The other thing that you could do if you wanted to move it along was regenerate the materialized views, and there are some ways that you can do that, and I think there's actually a script in Augur. Let's see, scripts. So depending what you called your Augur database, if you called it Augur, like there's a script here under Augur root scripts, map view explore, and then there's a shell script vacuum rebuild views and a SQL script that will actually that SQL script isn't useful. It's this one. Basically that will refresh all the materialized views manually.
Okay, I will try that one. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions that folks want to ask? Here, I'm happy to give you your time back, and I'm happy to continue to answer questions that you might have specific to your instance. Just let me know.
If there are no other questions, I can hark back to the DID conversation.
Yeah.
I was actually a little interested in that. There's one thing that has been bothering me for almost the entire time I've been working on Augur, and that is that we, just by the nature of the beast, are sort of reliant on the reliability of the platform where we get the data from, primarily GitHub in most cases. We sort of have to just make the assumption that the data that they give us is stable in some way. And for instance, one of the reasons originally I believe that we didn't use or store the GitHub's ID that they have on their end for the for each item is because we had no guarantee that it was stable. Like, we don't know officially if a repo ID on their end always remains the same. And
Yeah,
so
I think. Go
I
ahead.
like the idea of the decentralized ID as a way to assign a stable ID to a repo, to say, like, this repo is the same as this repo from like 2 years ago or whatever, even if on GitHub's end the ID has somehow changed. Because in their documentation, they don't give you any guarantee anywhere that that ID is stable.
Yeah, no, you're right. They don't, there's no like, what's it called? Software by contract, right? There's no
Yeah.
sort of stated, we will not change this identifier. I think it's through, 7 years of using the API that we came to realize that that identifier actually has never changed. And we find it pragmatically trustworthy despite their absence of a commitment. And to generate our own identifier about a repository, how would we do that part? For me, it quickly becomes kind of this hairball of things that can change a lot more than I expected them to, like the URL for a repository. So that offers no guarantee of a unique value over time. So what really else remains that could be used as an identifier for a specific repository, knowing that, someone could take that repository from GitHub and move it to GitLab. Do we track its uniqueness there?
I had a random idea. I don't know how reliable this might be, but I wonder if you could figure out the first commit ID of the repository, because like
The first
mean,
hash.
yeah, like the first commit hash. That wouldn't maybe necessarily be perfectly unique, because if there's a fork or something, then they'd share that. But I almost
Yeah.
wonder if you could maybe use that to kind of track. Although then you might have the problem if someone squashes the whole repository down into like one commit to release it or to put on another platform, then it's the same code base with two different things. But
yeah, there is also the additional issue that the Git log is entirely plastic, i.e., meaning that anyone can edit any part of the Git log to say anything they want at any time, including the commit hashes.
Yeah.
And push that to a repository as though it were a valid piece of data. So the Git log is really just sort of kind of a tragedy of the commons situation, where if anyone misuses it, then everyone suffers from that misuse, which is not great, but we're kind of sort of at the mercy of that read-write ability.
is that kind of currently what's being relied on for a lot of identifiers that we're kind of implicitly trusting?
Well, a lot of the work that the facade worker does relies on the Git log. So a lot of the stuff in that arena, yeah. Most of what the other collection workers rely on is actually data straight from GitHub. But the problem is that some of the data that GitHub relies on implicitly relies on the Git log. So, there's sort of like a train of responsibility there that, a lot of the roads that you're on eventually lead back to the Git log. And, like, for instance, I could make a commit right now that says it was committed on a date 50 years from now. And, the only way to verify that that is not true is for someone to look at it and say it's not that year yet, basically.
Yeah. And there is one repository in the big instance of Augur that has things that are 50 years in the future. And that's because they were successfully able to get those things into their commit log. And, the commit log is a canonical truth. It's one of the assumptions that all of these tools make. I think what this conversation kind of brings back to me as a reality is, although we have no contract with the platforms that their identifiers for a repository are going to be unique over time, it is the most stable and the least volatile a piece of identifying information about a repository that we have come across in practice. So even without the commitment from the platform, it still is very, there's no contractual immutability, but there's a practical immutability that we've begun to observe and don't have a better answer. We don't have a better solution for the platform, for the repository identifier question. Like we don't have anything that's better than holding our breath and trusting the platform identifier. And I think one of the reasons that it's probably going to remain stable is that lots of people have built lightweight tooling and tools like Augur around it. And there is, I think, in a lot of this tooling, an assumption about some form of the identifier being immutable. But yeah, John's right. None of that's guaranteed. It just seems to be the most reliable piece of not guaranteed information available.
Yeah, that's definitely sounding to me like a pretty neat little package for a paper too, of like, hey, how do you like how can you identify like software repositories in like a very reliable, consistent way that doesn't depend on some centralized service. I don't know how strongly I can make the argument that that counts as a distributed systems project, but I mean,
yeah, I
we'll
mean,
see.
you know, the ultimate way to do it, I suppose, would be creating almost like a genetic marker out of all of the actual files in a repository at a specific point in time. Right. So, but even that, I can come up with flaws with that, but because there's just very little other than these platform identifiers that's really completely immutable, you know, that couldn't be altered to change how you would generate the identifier. So it's kind of an interesting problem space, honestly.
Yeah, because now for some reason now I'm thinking of like, because I think having taken some cryptography classes before, like I'm sort of thinking like how like sort of AES or some of those kinds of systems working with like you just maybe have like some kind of content-based hash of like each commit that like rolls into the next one. But I don't know. I can think about this for the next couple of weeks and see what I come up
Yeah,
with.
yeah. I mean, I think the immutability question is, do we have anything that is more probable to be immutable than the platform identifier? I think the answer might be that we don't, but let's think about it. And we actually hit the end of the time allotted for this meeting. So I'm going to thank you all. Please use the Slack channel. Happy to respond there. And if you need if you get stuck in any particular place, ask for help in Slack and we will reach out to help. All right. Thanks, everyone.